They said it was just another explosion in the desert. But the fire that rose over Sahel that night didn't look human. It burned too long. Too bright. And when the smoke cleared, silence spread, the kind of silence that only follows when something forbidden has been destroyed. Was it a rebel base, or something much deeper, a secret built to keep Africa asleep? Because if that's true, then what the Malian soldiers destroyed wasn't a camp. It was a century-old lie. So, what really burned in the desert that night? Official reports confirmed it. The Malian armed forces had launched a decisive strike in northwestern Mali, hitting what they called a strategic gathering point of the Azawadian Liberation Front. The explosion lit up the desert like daylight. Witnesses spoke of fuel tanks, crude oil, or maybe stockpiled munitions. No one could say for sure. Hours later, the rebels issued threats, warning Tuareg civilians never to post videos near their bases again. But their silence since then speaks louder than their threats. Something extraordinary was destroyed that night, something they were never meant to lose. And if the desert itself could talk, it would whisper one question: what were they hiding there? They say betrayal doesn't happen overnight. It's built, one signature, one paycheck, one silence at a time. And in Mali, that silence has a price tag. When the smoke from the north cleared, investigators began to trace the money trail, and what they found was not a rebellion funded by faith, but by foreign wallets. The so-called humanitarian networks, the ones with shiny offices and perfect English reports, were moving funds that didn't build schools or clinics. They were buying loyalty. In Burkina Faso, authorities arrested members of a non-governmental organization, INSO. The lowest paid among them earned more than $3,500 a month, while others made over $6,000. Not bad for people who were supposedly there to observe. They called it data collection. But in the language of the Sahel, it meant something else: espionage. And when the names surfaced, so did the pattern. These weren't random employees. They were the gatekeepers, the people who had access to maps, logistics, military rotations. And, most dangerously, trust. That's the real commodity in Africa's hidden war: trust. It's the first thing sold and the hardest thing to buy back. Across Bamako, whispers grew louder. Why did certain locals live far above their means? Why did aid workers attend private meetings with foreign contractors at night? And why did every time Mali moved its troops, the enemy already seemed to know? The answers were simple, but devastating. Because the betrayal wasn't just military. It was moral. Every empire learns quickly that conquering Africa with guns is expensive. So they switched weapons, from bullets to budgets, from armies to agencies. They call it partnership. We call it occupation by paperwork. And it works perfectly, until someone like Traore burns the contract. There's a story told in Bamako's barracks. A young officer once asked his commander, "Sir, how do we know who the enemy is?" The old man smiled and said, "The enemy is the one who asks you to forget your motherland, and pays you for it." That's how empires survive, by recruiting Africans to betray Africa. They call it research. They call it training. They call it democracy. But in truth, it's the betrayal economy, a system that rewards silence and punishes dignity. And it goes beyond Mali. In every African capital, there are people who look like patriots by day and sign contracts by night. They write reports for foreign think tanks, forecasting instability, the very instability they help create. They warn of civil unrest, right after their sponsors cut the energy supply to the country they claim to support. Coincidence? No. It's business. Business built on betrayal. But here's the thing they didn't plan for: the Malian people stopped being afraid. When the government ordered audits on NGOs, when the military closed certain humanitarian offices, the same media that ignored decades of plunder suddenly screamed about freedom. Freedom for whom? For those who fed on chaos. Traore said it clearly, Africa must love its challenges. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a warning to every African still working for the enemy's paycheck. Because yes, the empire still pays well. But the cost is your soul. You can't serve two flags, one for your homeland and one for your master. And make no mistake, this war isn't just fought with drones or rifles. It's fought in spreadsheets, in meetings, in signatures. The battlefield is the inbox, the conference hall. The so-called workshop on peace. That's where Africa keeps losing, one document at a time. If you think this is exaggeration, look at the numbers. More than 60% of aid funds never reach African soil. They circulate through foreign consultants, offices in Paris, London, or Washington. And when the crisis deepens, they say, Africa failed. No. Africa was robbed, politely. Legally, and repeatedly. That's why the fire in the Sahel matters. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a symbolic revolt against the invisible network that profits from African pain. It was the moment Mali said, no more contracts signed in secret. No more colonialism hidden under the flag of compassion. And for the first time in decades, the desert answered back, with fire. If you believe that freedom cannot be bought, if you believe that betrayal has an expiration date, then let your voice be heard. Comment your thoughts, share this message, and remind the world that Africa's silence is over. Because when truth returns to the continent, the price of betrayal will finally be too high to pay. They said a soldier could never be a leader. They said guns can't build nations. But in Mali, the man with the gun was the only one still standing when the lies collapsed. The civilians had surrendered to fatigue. To pressure, to diplomacy that only served the strong. But the general, he didn't. He looked at the storm and saw a map. When Assimi Goita spoke to his people, his words weren't written by speechwriters or polished by foreign consultants. They came from the trenches. Life, he said, is like a flight through turbulence. The captain says buckle up. It shakes. People panic. Then it clears. That's how we move, through storms. Toward destiny. His voice wasn't poetic, it was surgical. It reminded Mali that resilience is not a choice, it's survival. Many outside Africa laughed. They called him a dictator. A usurper, a soldier out of place. But the truth is, the modern empire fears nothing more than a disciplined African with purpose. Because soldiers don't beg. They act. And this time, they act for Africa. The West expected Mali to break. They cut off aid, they froze accounts, they spread rumors of collapse. Yet the opposite happened. The army grew stronger. Villages rallied behind it, and even the sand seemed to choose a side. For the first time, Mali wasn't reacting, it was advancing. Observers started to notice. The Tuareg insurgents who once moved freely in the north now hid in fear. Their convoys, once parading for foreign cameras, vanished in smoke. The Qadia militias pressed from one side, the regular army from the other. Every time the rebels moved, they were hunted. Every time they called for help, none came. And when foreign sponsors tried to send a message through the media, it was drowned out by a single image, a Malian flag rising over the ruins. But beyond the battlefields, another war was unfolding, a diplomatic one. Algeria's shadow lingered over the northern sands. It backed the TRX movement, cloaked as concern for the Tuaregs. Yet history remembers, the same colonial rulers drew the borders that split the Tuaregs apart. The same lines that created Mali's pain also defined Algeria's pride. And now, brothers divided by a ruler's pen were being forced to fight. Then came Russia. Sergei Lavrov stood before microphones and spoke not as an outsider but as a historian. Africa, he said, was divided with a ruler. Straight lines cutting through souls. He reminded the world that those artificial borders were designed not to organize, but to control. Even today, he warned, those who drew them still provoke escalation. In that moment, the room fell silent. Because for the first time, someone had said aloud what Africa always knew, that every conflict in the Sahel is a ghost of the colonial past. But Goita understood something deeper. He didn't need redrawn maps, he needed new loyalties. He didn't ask Russia to fight his wars. He asked for respect, the kind that comes from sovereignty. Not subservience. And in that simple shift, the balance of power moved. While Western diplomats whispered about stability, Mali built alliances of conviction. Soldiers trained in the field. Not in conferences. Energy projects restarted without donor conditions. Roads were paved with local funds. And for the first time in years, the Malian flag was flying, not as a symbol of dependence, but of defiance. The empire didn't understand this new Africa. It still believed control came from fear. But Goita and his men had learned another truth, that courage can be contagious. Every speech he gave, every visit to the front line, turned soldiers into believers. They weren't fighting for orders. They were fighting for meaning. In the villages, children began to shout his name, not as a savior, but as a mirror. Because in him, they saw what their fathers were told never to become, free men. Critics said he was reckless. But reckless men don't rebuild nations, visionaries do. He gambled with isolation, and won unity. He gambled with sanctions, and gained self-reliance. In every strike, every defiance, he exposed the weakness of the old world order, an order that needs Africa weak to feel powerful. And as the desert quieted, a new kind of silence took its place, not the silence of fear, but of focus. The kind that comes before something historic. Mali wasn't just fighting for Mali anymore. It was fighting for a continent's dignity. If you've ever wondered what leadership looks like when the cameras stop rolling, this is it. A man standing between two storms, refusing to kneel. A soldier who became a mirror for a continent rediscovering itself. If you believe that Africa deserves leaders who act instead of apologize, who fight instead of beg, then share this story. Because somewhere in Bamako, a soldier is still marching through the dust, not for glory, but for freedom. And every step he takes shakes the empire that once called Africa its possession. They say Africa's map was drawn in a room with no windows. Men who had never seen the Sahel drew lines through it, straight, cold, perfect. One stroke of a European pen split families, tribes, and faiths, another gave birth to nations built on fractures. Those lines became our borders. And every war since then, Rwanda, Sudan, Congo, Mali, has been a scar from that ruler's edge. When Lavrov spoke about Africa's straight lines of division, the world heard diplomacy. But Africans heard memory. Because those lines were not geography, they were weapons. Borders became cages, and identity became a liability. The empire didn't need to return, it only needed to watch us tear each other apart inside the walls it left behind. That's the real genius of colonialism, it doesn't end. It mutates. The empire learned to outsource the fight, Mali against Tuaregs, Niger against rebels, Algeria against suspicion, all while the same old capitals profit from arms, minerals, and fear. And when the dust settles, they offer aid, peace missions, and development plans. They sell you the cure to the disease they designed. But something changed when the fire rose over the Sahel. For the first time, Africans saw the lines glowing, not on maps, but in their minds. They began to ask, who told us we were different? Who decided where Africa ends and Africa begins? In the classrooms of Bamako, teachers started using new maps, ones where Mali wasn't a fractured state but a heartbeat in a living continent. In Ouagadougou, the young stopped saying, Francophone Africa. They said simply, Africa. And across the Sahel, soldiers carried flags not for nations, but for the idea that these borders were never sacred, they were scars to be healed. The African Union once debated redrawing the lines, but it feared chaos. They said opening the map would open Pandora's box. But maybe the box has already been open for a century, spilling conflict, poverty, and division. Maybe the only way to close it is not to erase the lines, but to outgrow them. Because the empire doesn't fear war, it fears unity. And unity begins when Africa refuses to see itself through the colonizer's geometry. That's why they fear the AES. Not because of its guns, but because it threatens to erase the lines they drew. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, 3 nations defying the map and writing a new one with courage instead of ink. And now, others are watching. Ghana, Chad, even far Madagascar, the pulse is spreading. Each country that joins doesn't just shift alliances, it shifts consciousness. It proves that sovereignty is not isolation, it's reclamation. The West calls it dangerous. They say it destabilizes the region. But what they really mean is, Africa is no longer theirs to manage. Every empire has its myths. Ours was that we were too divided to stand together. But the Sahel just proved that myth wrong. From the dunes of Timbuktu to the coasts of the Red Sea, a single truth is echoing: Africa was never divided by nature. It was divided by design. And when you understand design, you can redesign. That's what the AES is doing, not breaking the past, but rebuilding it on our terms. A confederation of courage, not convenience. A brotherhood of defense, not dependence. And the more they try to isolate it, the more it becomes magnetic. In the West, they whisper about the shadow of empires. But in the Sahel, that shadow is shrinking. Because light travels fastest where fear once lived. If you can still hear the voice of the colonizer telling you who your enemy is, remember this: your real enemy is the voice itself. It lives in division, in doubt, in the belief that your neighbor's suffering is not your concern. That voice is dying now, drowned by the sound of boots marching in unison. So if you believe Africa deserves to define itself again, not as lines, but as life, say it. Write it. Be part of it. Because every time one of us refuses to see another African as foreign, the shadow fades a little more. The borders were drawn to keep us apart. But every generation that burns one, even in spirit, redraws Africa closer to its true shape. Not divided. Not colonized. But whole. They thought the storm would end in the Sahel. But the wind changed direction, across the ocean, past the coral reefs, until it reached a red island once forgotten by the world, Madagascar. For decades, it stood apart, distant, quiet, loyal to whoever ruled the sea lanes. But silence doesn't mean peace. When the ex-president began to speak from exile, from a safe place, he said, something in Africa shifted again. You cannot call yourself the leader of a nation while hiding beyond its shores. And on that day, the people of Madagascar understood, power without presence is illusion. Inside the capital, soldiers of the Capsat army took control. Calm, precise, and disciplined, not rebels, but patriots tired of manipulation. They were not fighting their people. They were protecting them from invisible hands funding chaos. Rumors spread quickly: foreign money, secret security groups, operations disguised as protests. The fingerprints looked familiar, the same pattern seen in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey before the AES rose. Then came a warning from Paris. If you resist, they said, your people will suffer. It wasn't advice. It was prophecy, the kind whispered by those who believe Africa must remain obedient to eat. But Madagascar didn't kneel. The soldiers held the line. The commander addressed the nation, his words firm, stripped of politics. We are not here to rule. We are here to prevent the island from burning. That single sentence echoed across the Indian Ocean. For the first time, the world realized the AES effect had crossed the sea. At the same moment, in Moscow, a quiet conversation unfolded. Russian media, Sputnik, RT, began reporting on the Madagascar question. They spoke not of coups, but of realignments. Insiders revealed discussions of a possible security partnership between Madagascar and Russia, an alliance designed to deter infiltration. Not invited. If true, it meant something profound. The model of the AES was evolving into something bigger, a new security architecture for the global south. They call it the EOS bloc. Not an empire. Not a copy. A parallel idea, born from the ashes of dependency, shaped by sovereignty, bound by shared defense. AES was the first wave. EOS would be the second, a network stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Western analysts dismissed it as wishful thinking. But the same analysts once laughed at the idea that Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso could unite. Now they send envoys begging for dialogue. The twist is not that Madagascar fell under new influence. The twist is that it chose, freely, deliberately, to secure itself without permission. And that is the real revolution. When Africa starts choosing for itself, the global order trembles. Because the old system survives only if Africans remain predictable. But there was nothing predictable about an island once isolated. Now joining the chorus of defiance. From the dunes of Gao to the cliffs of Antananarivo, the same rhythm beats, independence, not isolation. Mali taught Africa how to fight again. Madagascar might teach it how to think again. Imagine the map a year from now, a triangle of stability stretching from the Sahel to the Indian Ocean, connected not by colonial treaties but by principle. No one saw it coming, because no one believed Africa could synchronize without being told to. And yet, the fire that started in Mali is now reflected on the waters of the Mozambique Channel. The AES shockwave has become an African tide. And when the tide rises, even the old empires must move their feet. They say every fire dies. But this one didn't. It spread, from the dunes of Mali to the highlands of Madagascar, from whispers in Bamako to the roar of a continent learning to speak again. The maps haven't caught up yet, but the people have. You can see it in their eyes, in the children waving hand-painted flags, in the soldiers who no longer fight for salary but for meaning. In the farmers who look to the horizon and say, we are no longer waiting for help. We are becoming it. This is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a continent. One that defines its own allies. Its own destiny, its own dignity. And yes, it will stumble, revolutions always do, but the direction is irreversible. Africa has stopped begging for space in someone else's narrative. It is writing its own. If you've stayed with this story till now, you're not just a viewer, you're part of the awakening. Because this is more than geopolitics. This is a generation remembering who they are. So if the courage of Mali, the defiance of Niger, the unity of Burkina Faso, and the awakening of Madagascar have touched you, don't let it end here. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Let your voice be counted among those who refuse to kneel. Because what began as a spark in the desert has become a flame across the seas. And now it's our turn, to keep that fire alive. Together, until Africa burns bright enough to light the world.